Hello, everybody. So glad that you have joined us today. We are looking forward to a really great conversation. This is a session on how to identify and support innovation and social entrepreneurs and local leadership. And we're hoping for a really robust interaction with all of you through the chat. So please jump in and introduce yourselves and give us your thoughts via chat questions. We're looking forward to hearing those. This session is, we've heard a lot in these really fantastic content in the last couple days with some very big, bold ideas. And this session is going to be thinking about, like, how do we individually really build our practice and think about on a very real tactical level how we're making decisions and how we are interacting with people in the field while we're doing that. So those are the two goals of this section are both to look at different frameworks for funders that some funders use. We're going to just look at a couple of them and understand that these are a few of many and aren't meant to be the answer for you, just to help you start to think about it. And then the second is to really take a look at the ways in which we make those decisions while we're working in the field. What really works for organizations doing work on the ground when they're interacting with potential funders, and where do things go wrong, and how can we think about making that interaction really collaborative one. So I have some fantastic people joining me today. I'm super psyched for the conversation with them. Two of us are funders, two of us are the doers who are really making the work happen. And so I'd like to have each of you just take a minute to introduce yourselves, the problem that you're solving, what your solution is, and what brought you personally to the work. And how about if we start with you, Wawira?
Thank you, Stephanie, and hi, everyone. I'm very excited to be here. So I'm from Nairobi, Kenya. I'm actually in Nairobi, Kenya now. And I run an organization called Food for Education, where we provide low-cost, nutritious meals to kids in public primary schools. And we've been doing that full-time from around 2016. I started off with just 25 children a day and now provide meals to 30,000 children every single day, and use technology to streamline the process of sourcing from smallholder farmers, production in central kitchens, and distribution using, better logistics to ensure that kids get high quality, nutritious meals and they're able to stay in school and learn. We've seen a lot of improvement in terms of education outcomes and nutrition outcomes, and are excited to be talking about how we can do more for the world's most vulnerable.
Thanks, Wawira. Mariana?
Yes, also very happy to be here. I am in Lima, Peru. I am from Peru originally, and I live here, and I'm the co-founder and CEO at Laboratoria. We are a social impact organization that prepares women that haven't been able to start a professional career yet to start careers and then to grow careers in the region's tech sector. So we started, it's actually going to be 7 years, so it's been a while already, with a small bootcamp program to prepare students as software developers and then connect them with job opportunities in tech. And we've grown a lot since. Today we run bootcamp programs in Peru, in Chile, in Mexico, in Brazil, in Colombia. We have over 2,200 alumni, over 80% of them historically working in the tech sector. On average, they triple their income once they start working, and we've helped over 800 companies hire diverse talent to help close the talent gap in the sector, but also the gender gap, and make sure that women are also part of designing and building the technology that will play such an important role in our region's future. And I'm super excited to be here.
I asked Wawira and Mariana to join our conversation today because, first of all, they're doing incredible work. Both organizations are in the DRK portfolio, but also Mariana and Wawira are very thoughtful about the sort of bigger picture of our ecosystem and willing to be honest. So I'm hoping they're gonna challenge us as donors about our practice a little bit and give us what it really looks like on the other side. Larry, would you mind also taking a minute to introduce yourself?
Happy to do it. Thanks, Stephanie, and thanks to all of you who are zooming into this. It's a pretty amazing 3 days. So I'm the founder and I lead an organization called Focusing Philanthropy, and we have been working now for 10 years to try to address what we think is a barrier that many donors face as they grapple with making their philanthropic decisions. And that is, it's extremely difficult, especially for international donors, to be able to identify really compelling programs that are achieving powerful impacts, and to conduct themselves the kind of diligence that they're looking for as a precondition for making their decisions, much less be able to monitor the impact on the ground that's achieved through their generosity if they do decide to support something. And our observation is that these challenges are basically paralyzing for many donors. They don't see a path to good answers, and therefore they default to supporting things that are kind of brand name, mainly domestic in the United States. And the result is that worthy organizations internationally and in the United States don't get the support that they deserve and that would help them increase their impact. So we've been doing this for 10 years. We have a small portfolio of implementing partners that meet our rigorous screening criteria, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. Last year, we raised and deployed about $30 million to 14 organizations and worked with about 400 families and small foundations and private companies to support some of their giving decisions.
Fantastic, Larry, and we are going to hear more about that for sure. I'm Stephanie Cornell. I am a managing director. Well, I'm actually in a new role as a venture partner at Draper Richards Kaplan Foundation. Draper Richards Kaplan is really focused on early stage organizations. We think of that as post-pilot pre-scale organizations that have indications of something really effective happening on the ground and are ready to scale significantly. And we'll also talk more about that. And we are working with organizations primarily on their capacity building. So we're a granting organization, but we also spend a lot of time trying to help them build their capacity around fundraising, their boards, their IT and financial systems, all the nuts and bolts that put an organization in a good place to grow. So I do want to share a few frameworks just to get our conversation started, and hope that you will all jump in with sharing your own thoughts and questions based on your own experiences. This is an opportunity to really look at a couple practices and say, what would we be interested in adopting ourselves? What doesn't work for us? How do we think about this in light of the conversations we've been having in the past couple days around shifting resources and decision making to more proximate leadership? So please, we're very interested in your thoughts as well. And Larry, maybe we could just start. Can you describe for everybody how the decision-making framework that you use at Focusing Philanthropy to decide who your partners are going to be?
Sure. I'll start by maybe invoking what might sound like a little odd, but sort of an investment vocabulary. In contrast to DRK's portfolio, which I would call venture philanthropy, we are what I would call private equity philanthropy. In other words, we're looking for organizations that have already achieved a scale that allows them to demonstrate that they're achieving material human impacts. So our observation is that many nonprofits, I'm tempted to say most, report on activity rather than on impact. That would mean that they might say, well, we worked with 500 children, or we helped 100 homeless people. Those kind of counts, in our view, are counts of activity, not impact or results. What we look for are nonprofits that are reporting on the actual consequence in terms of changed life circumstances on a sustained basis for that result from the programs that we hope to support. So all of what we do is designed to embrace programs that are delivering life-changing human impacts. That's our primary screening criteria, and our kind of defining lens. We focus on two categories of criteria. One are ones we would call generic. That's any organization that we'd be interested in would need to have certain attributes regarding governance, reporting, financial reporting, the systems and the structure that would be confidence inspiring. And then beyond that, we look for this practical evidence of life-changing impact that I allude to, and we have a whole methodology which we can go into if you like, by which we do that. I'll just say one more thing, which is that we're trying to build a portfolio of giving opportunities for our donors, and the challenge for us is that each of our relationships with an implementing partner is very sustained. It's labor intensive, and therefore we can't have hundreds of them. We have a staff of 8, and there's a practical limit to how many partner-like relationships we can support at any one time. So the challenge is to have diversity in our portfolio, but keep the portfolio small enough to be manageable. And so we never start by saying, oh, that sounds like a really interesting nonprofit. Rather, we start by saying, what is an area of profound human need that's not already represented in our portfolio that might be a candidate for us to address, and where we think there's an opportunity for private philanthropy to play a meaningful role, as opposed to what governments might do or other larger institutional players. And so we start with that kind of a threshold question about areas of human need not otherwise addressed, and we then employ a process to hone in on that sector, learn about it, and in so doing inform ourselves about the alternative programmatic options that might be available, and finally the nonprofits that are active in what appear to be the most promising tactical approaches. So there's a lot that we do before we would have a first conversation with any individual nonprofit, and that's both so that we can be sufficiently informed about what we're doing and what we're looking for, that we don't waste the nonprofit's time. We don't want our interactions with the nonprofit to be an educational experience. It's not the way we want to learn about the space. That's a burden that we think is unfairly put on a lot of nonprofits. Please tell us about your broad area of activity. We want to figure that out through other things that don't depend on burdening the resources of the NGO itself. So all of that kind of funnel approach precedes direct interaction with any nonprofit, by which point we know what we're looking for, and we can proceed with higher confidence that it's a productive discussion both for ourselves and for whoever we're speaking with.
So it sounds, Larry, like your approach is very heavy on identifying the part of the ecosystem that you want to be addressing and forming your own clear theory of change before you're actually looking at organizations.
That's right.
And what about?
Yeah.
And what about that? And what about that? Do you feel is like the really not the most important piece of what you're doing? And what about it might you be interested in testing or challenging?
Mm-hmm. Well, we recognize that we can't be expert on every area in which we might want to be philanthropically active. And so I think the challenge is to network and tap deeper experts and to build relationships with them so we can evaluate both, the quality and if I can say it, the agenda of whoever we're talking to as we try to educate ourselves about areas that look like potential candidates for us to explore. And so we've really invested quite a bit of time and effort to try to build those relationships with peer funders. And through our network of implementing partners, obviously they also have insight into kind of adjacent spaces and are really powerful sources of insight for us that we can apply when we look at something supplemental to what we might be doing directly with them. So that kind of, where do we look for expertise? How do we evaluate what we're hearing? How do we differentiate between different types of implementing tactics to address a particular area of human need, so that we can decide which of them seem to be most effective and lend themselves most to the type of support that we're capable of providing. So those are all kind of key screening questions that we grapple with every time we look at a potential new area. And our process, our funnel approach, as we think of it internally, where we're starting with a broad observation and then we're honing in that ultimately leads to some conversations with nonprofits, that can take a year or more. And I would say at least half the time or more often, we don't end up adopting any new nonprofit because we don't find what we're looking for at the end. And we try to be disciplined and not and not just become captivated with the space if we can't find something that meets our criteria.
Thank you, Larry. So that's a really good example. I mean, that's a very complete theory of how to work in the ecosystem. And I'll just put out there then how DRK thinks about it, which is with a different lens. And also thank you to any Siegel folks who happen to be joining us today. Also just give a mention to Siegel because I think they're also a very interesting and effective different version than either Focusing Philanthropy or DRK. So DRK's core belief is that if you find really strong leadership and an organization that is fundamentally designed to get to scale, that if you give this support early on, you'll allow them to really grow and get to scale with their impact. And so we are looking for organizations that have very strong leadership because it is such an early stage that we know is going to be able to learn and pivot on what they're doing, who's able to attract resources, and who is able to very, very clearly identify and hone in on the strategy that they're going to use. So it's a very particular type of leader that is really, really strong at this early stage of growth. DRK is very focused on scale. And I'm just going to point this out as that's one way to look at the world, and certainly, very certainly not the only one, because as we've been talking about a lot at this symposium, there is a lot of different ways that people make enormous impact in their communities that isn't really tied closely to scale. And so DRK, if I ask myself the same question I asked Larry, like the nut is around that essential design of the organization that could get to impact at scale the way that we've been challenging ourselves in the last few years is how are you going to marry any tension between that and really identifying strong proximate leadership that completely understand the issue that they're working on in a much deeper way than we ever will sitting in our offices. And how do you bring those ideas together? So that's a tension that we work with all of the time. We look for really data-based cultures because we really believe that constant learning based on information that organizations are taking in is important in the field. And we're really taking a bet on organizations, but we're at a stage of growth where we can see some promise. So just to identify that decision-making, we're asking organizations to really say, can you see which piece of the problem you're solving? And do you understand the marketplace that you're working in, what your path to scale might be, and how you're going to execute on that? And even though people don't have a really completely defined idea on that, and Mariana and Wawira have done a lot of iteration over time on those ideas, that's the core concepts that we're addressing. And then to just throw a third out of, again, many frameworks, but a third framework out, Siegel Family Foundation is really focused on local leadership, community-driven. They're basing their grant making in country, and each of those countries have their own strategy. And I'm sure they can throw into the chat other important pieces of this, but they're really looking for early stage organizations with visionary leaders that are extremely community driven and close to the work. And they remain very close to the work too by having their staff in the countries that they're working in, which I think is a really important idea. So Mariana and Wawira, if I can ask you both to just say, since I know that you've been through the DRK process, can we just use that as an example to help think about where the framework of decision-making that DRK used really fit what you were trying to do and where you were where you were making it work, but it wasn't necessarily the way that you were looking at the world? Can you identify the differences there for us? I'm giving you a chance to pick on DRK.
If you want, I can get started. It's actually hard to pick on DRK. I think DRK has been such a great partner in our experience, and I see many things that are unique about the DRK process and that truly make a difference from the standpoint of an organization. No? To begin with, since well, it's been a while because we went through the DRK process, I think it was back in 2016 or 17. But I mean, I would start with the personal level, no? From the beginning, I felt that Natalie, who was our managing director, truly cared about our work, no, deeply. And at a personal level, she wanted to understand, she wanted to know more. The fact that I don't know if it's still going on with COVID, but she came down here, she spent a week with me, and she truly, I think, asked the right questions. No, I felt I could be completely open about what are our strengths, what are our weaknesses, what do we know, and have clarity about what we actually have no idea how we're going to get there. So I think that starting by that personal connection already made a very important difference. I think really trying to calm down and see things over here, and understand that yes, paper can hold everything, but you really need to see the reality and meet not only me and my team, but our students, our hiring companies, and understand their challenges firsthand. So I think that was also quite significant. The other thing that I would signal is that in my experience, most of our funders are still project-based funders, no? And I always talk to them and try to say, we are not a project-based organization, no? We are an organization, and this is our core work, our strategy, our plans for the future. Yes, I can work around and make whatever I do look like a project, for the purposes of this grant, but that's really just makeup, no? In the end, this is my core. This is what I want to accomplish next year and the year after. In the ideal work, you come and chip in towards that overall goal and strategy for growth, no? And I think DRK is one of the very few organizations that works that way, no? It's not a specific project-based grant. It's tell me what you are going to do over the next 3 to 5 years, and I'll contribute to finance part of that. And I think that's one for me personally, one of the main things that ideally will change and become more flexible in the nonprofit world. And then finally, this is one of the things that I was a little bit doubtful of at the beginning with DRK, the board thing, no? That you'll get someone in your board. I was like, I'm not sure, but I don't know them. How are they going to join my board? And it was actually a game changer, because I think that when you get to organizations that are precisely in that early stage, post-pilot, but pre-scale, I actually didn't, not like when Natalie joined our board, that's when we really gave shape to everything in a more formal and structured way, And I think her impact in our governance, our growth, in consolidating really the basis of a strong and sustainable organization was huge. So I think, I can only think of those good things that in my experience have been pros of the DRK experience.
Thanks, Mariana. That highlights a couple really important ideas, especially that project-based versus general operating funding, which is just like gold for organizations to be able to have the agility to see, they understand what's happening and the ability to pivot with funds that are flexible, I think is a really, really important idea. So, Wawira, how about you? And don't be nice. Feel free to give us something to hang our hat on here about things we can think about.
Yeah, I think, so I agree with Mariana's points around my experience with DRK being similar. I think we joined around the same time. Really, the unrestricted funding was such a big thing for us, because it was money that we could innovate, that we could create what we needed at the moment, and didn't really have to kind of like create projects. And so we don't actually raise around projects, we raise around like the core, what we're doing, this is our strategy. So we could raise, for example, for a kitchen, for example, it's not really a project, but it's, someone could fund a kitchen, but it's tied to our overall strategy of what we want to accomplish. So I think like one of my, key hesitations around the time of due diligence was the due diligence process itself with DRK. And I think that's something that, a lot of funders kind of like think, I understand the need to have kind of information, the way that you process information, and the way, for example, you need a financial model, you need a business plan, you need to understand where the business is going in 3 years or 18 months and things like that. And I was, privileged that I had been part of an accelerator just before, and that's how I met the DRK team, where I had created a business plan, where I had created a financial model and things like that. But I always question, what about someone who hasn't gone through an accelerator like that and doesn't have a financial plan, doesn't have a business plan, has a really good, has pivoted many times, has started the organization. It's post concept and pre-scale, as Mariana said, but you don't have the pieces of paper, for example, that prove that you're post concept, right? So you could have, obviously you have your audited financials, but also you don't have a financial model for the next 3 years and things like that. So I think that something, that is something I think could be a barrier, especially for proximal leaders, for leaders who are more local like us, who don't have the expertise sometimes to make a financial model, don't have the expertise to make very in-depth business plans. And I think that was something that could have been a barrier if we hadn't gone through the accelerator, for example. And I also think, someone asked a question around language. So DRK itself is so the question of, there was a question, I think, in the chat about VCPE, but I see a lot of business language coming to the philanthropy space. And for a lot of local leaders, my first time in Silicon Valley was 2016, right? I'd never been there. I didn't know the language. I didn't know what 10X means or 40X means. Language like that is very specific to that region where, in the business language, when it comes over into philanthropy, a lot of local leaders don't know that you communicate skill by using X, right? And something as simple like that makes a funder connect with you if you're able to speak in their language and how they understand numbers. But I've seen, I can't say that it was, I don't know if it would have been a bias because I already had learned through the accelerator how to communicate in that way, but I think it was an added advantage that I was able to communicate in that way. And I think that could be a disadvantage for a lot of people if they don't know how to speak in Silicon Valley speak or in funder speak. Yeah.
I think that, Wawira, that's such a good point. And Jessica, thank you for asking that question, which, I'll tell you how DRK is trying to grapple with that. And we have a long way to go on this, but we are actually born out of venture capital funding and some very successful and thoughtful venture capitalists. So that has completely been embedded in the history of our organization. We've been through a process in the last year of really examining what our language on our website looks like, what kinds of questions we ask entrepreneurs when we're talking to them, what people are in the room when we're having that conversation. We're trying to look at every piece of how we're communicating. And I would just say there's a very big difference between an organization that starts on the ground and has embedded in local ways of communicating and so forth, and one that comes from a venture capital background and has to try to back their way into this. So we're going to be on that learning journey, I think, for a long time, but with real intention around it. And I think it's a really good point because it's not just about the language. It really infuses the decision making when you use that language. So we have a lot to learn there. And one of the most important things we've done, in addition to really examining what we have, our actual language, is to put 2 people in Nairobi on our staff, which I think is one of the most important ways that you can be really understanding the work on the ground, is to actually be there, or to be talking to organizations like Siegel that have done a really good job of vetting and have been very proximate in their own grant making. So there was a couple questions, Larry. Can you see those directed to you? Okay. Yeah. One was, does focusing philanthropy provide only funding for specific projects or programs with clear outcomes, or can it provide flexible, untied funding at the organizational level? And there was a related question to that around organizations that are focused on system change and how you think about those in your grant making.
Okay. Let me try to respond to those, but before I do, I'd like to comment on the language topic for just a second. I think the language that we use at Focusing Philanthropy is partly a function of the fact that we have 2 separate worlds that we relate to. We are both grant makers and we are fundraisers. And I think it's exactly right. What Wawira is saying is exactly right. It shouldn't be the burden on the implementing nonprofit leadership to try to do like simultaneous translation all the time of what they hear, from funders. On the other hand, we found it quite helpful, just as frankly tactically, to be able to use a vocabulary when we're talking to donors that they recognize, and that tends to help validate the fact that we are thinking about the philanthropic sector as basically another way to deploy capital. The philanthropic capital is to be deployed in a fashion that that I think the donor, especially donors whose wealth comes from the finance world, they're looking for a return on investment, and whatever vocabulary they use to say it, their internal monologue, I think, about what they are considering supporting is really a function of what their professional history has been. And so we try to be alert to language and the differences in effective language depending on who we're talking to. So that's just an observation. It's a particular challenge, I think, for us. I think probably many people listening in either already have the dollars in hand, and the question is how to deploy them, or they're looking to raise the money and they already have the program clarity. And we've found, I think, the hardest way to do it, where we're both trying to raise the money and deploy it. So we have these two worlds that are really frequently have little congruence that we're trying to reconcile and be a bridge. So it's just an observation that is reflective of a challenge that we grapple with all the time.
Correct. Yeah, and Larry, we have the same challenge at DRK. We're also fundraising.
Yeah, sure. So as far back to the questions that you forwarded, Stephanie, we do not provide general support. We fund what we and the nonprofit agree are priority initiatives selected by the nonprofit, from which we can say, well, we feel comfortable supporting A, but maybe not B. So we never want to be imposing our kind of programmatic ideas or sense of priorities on a potential nonprofit implementing partner, but we want to hear from them. Having said that, if you're a student of behavioral economics, and for example Daniel Kahneman, who kind of invented behavioral economics, what you would know is that again, there's a sort of an internal monologue that donors and most decision makers engage in, we believe. They're basically trying to fill in the sentence that starts with, if I give X dollars, I'll get Y results. And the ability to connect the contribution to an outcome that's expressed in human terms is something that we think is highly motivating. And so we try to frame the appeals that we make so that they accomplish two things. The first is clearly that they're advancing a priority of the nonprofit that wouldn't otherwise be adequately funded. But second, that it helps to fill in that sentence. Our experience over 10 years is that when we have a clear sentence, so for example, for $50, I can restore the sight of a blind person in the developing world, that's a powerful sentence, and it motivates donor behavior. That's what we're looking for. We're trying to reconcile those kind of things. So I hope that's sort of responsive to I think it was the first of the two questions that were asked, and I've already forgotten what the second one was.
It was just around how systems change, which I think is a challenge given that statement. How do you think about systems change?
Yeah. So we try to think in terms of two levels. The first level is, if we support a program that has proven impact, what can we accomplish, again, in human terms? How many lives can we affect in a material and positive way through the direct contributions? That's you might say transactional, or it's it's specific and immediate. But we have the second thought, which is that to the extent that we can help organizations get a level of scale where they're proving out a model at a scale that is material enough and replicable enough that they have standing in the broad area in which they're active, whether it's addressing refugees or whether it's increasing agricultural productivity or whatever it might be. We think that has huge value, because if we can help an organization get over the credibility threshold in the international community as a whole, we think that they can have dramatic influence on the systems by which these issues are addressed, way beyond what they can accomplish through their direct program. So we're very alert to scale, not only, let's call it, on the micro level, that is to say within the organization, but also on the macro level, where the organization's behavior, success, credibility, visibility are sufficient to motivate other organizations to say, well, wait a minute, let us assess what we're doing in light of the success that organization XYZ is already achieving. And we find that has a very powerful knockoff effect.
I think it's fascinating that we are, we're hearing this conversation, some of the real tensions between the messiness of what happens on the ground and the need to be fluid a lot of the times, and the translation of that to donors, and the need to both access their resources and educate them at the same time. I think there's a lot of inherent tension in that whole idea. As we try to, in the last session, we heard the word courageous philanthropy, be courageous philanthropists. So there's a lot of tensions as people try to answer to their donors, to their boards, and also be doing the work that is true to what's actually really happening on the ground, and not neat packaging. I think there's tensions, especially for organizations like that have come out of a business framework like DRK has. Somebody asked a question about access and how you get on the radar of organizations. DRK happens to have an open application process, and therefore we read about over 2,000 applications a year. That is takes real resources, and so a lot of you won't be able to do that or have that capacity. And I think it's important and valuable for somebody to be providing that access, for some of us in the field to be providing that access, but I think that it's also possible for other people to draft off of that work. And so the more that we as funders can collaborate and hear from each other about good organizations, I think that's potentially could close the lens, but it also is an opportunity to widen the lens. And I'm just acknowledging that not a lot of funders do have an open application process, because if you have, a staff of 2 to 10 people and you're going to read 2,000 applications a year, that's a very heavy lift. Wawira and Mariana, maybe you could jump back in here. I'd be really interested in hearing from both of you. What are like some practices that if you were writing a blog post on things I wish funders knew, what would be a couple of the key points you would want to make to us?
I can mention something, Stephanie, related to the previous point, actually, because I do think it's important to state that flexible funding or general operational support doesn't equal no metrics, no outcomes, no outputs. No, I think it's quite the opposite, actually. For me, the barrier is like the project framework. But when we get funders that are willing to understand the strategy as a whole and see how they can support that, we provide super clear metrics of, okay, I don't know, in the next 3 years, this is what our operation is going to cost, and this is what we're going to achieve, no? But it's just the mindset of a little bit more similar to what a regular startup would do, raising money. You know, this is what I'm going to accomplish in the next 3 years, and this is what I need funding for, instead of trying to cut that into, oh yeah, here is one project or a different project, or it's like the whole package together. But I do think that's important to clarify, because then the funding is flexible, because you can accommodate it as you see fit to attain those goals that you've already committed to, because that's your strategy, and that the funder agrees that those are the ones that make sense, no? So I think that's truly important along the way. And for us, it has been a game changer to actually find that type of donor. So that's one thing I would say. That's one thing I wish funders knew, no? That flexible or non-project-based funding doesn't mean no metrics or no outcomes. And it's our work to actually show and translate our impact, no? And I think as social sector organizations, we need to invest in tracking, documenting, and communicating really well what's the result of that investment. No, in our case, for example, last year we embarked in a big research paper about the social and economic return of our program. No, so for every dollar that someone invests in Laboratoria, what can they expect in terms of social return? And we discovered that in a year, that dollar has come back to society in terms of increases in income for our students, no? So I think that's our duty and our responsibility, and it's quite important. And then maybe I'll mention one other thing in terms of what funders should know, because this also happens often. And I think that as leaders of organizations that are scaling, we need to be very responsible with the people that we serve and the people that we employ, no? So for example, Laboratoria employs around 100 people, no, in across several countries in Latin America. And we serve, 1,000 students a year, no? So that's something for which I need to prepare ahead. So I need a solid runway, no? I wouldn't be able to sleep if I had like a 6-month runway, and then these people are gonna lose their jobs if I don't get a next grant. And it also surprises me, because many funders are thinking about, okay, what's your gap for next year? And I'm like, if I had a gap for next year, I literally couldn't sleep at night. Like I cannot afford a gap for next year. I have a gap, okay, for the year after, or the one after that, no? So I think this also goes with the mindset of understanding that we cannot be project-based organizations that are on and off with our staff and our commitments to our beneficiaries. You know, we need to be able to offer a value proposition that's more medium term and deliver on that, no? And I think that's really important for funders to understand as well, no? So I'd love to see more funders that are willing to say, actually, it's amazing that you're covered for next year. How can we start talking about supporting you for the year after, no? And it's good that you have the funds there to support your team for a relatively stable period of time if anything happens and comes along. So yeah, that's another reflection that I often have and think it's important to share.
Yeah, excellent, Mariana. Wawira, what would you add to that?
I completely agree with everything Mariana said. I think that, you know, a lot of times, I think there's some, you know, when I think about entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs, you know, every time I think, why did we get into this? It's actually the hardest job in the world, trying to change, you know, the world in this way and try to change lives in this way. And I think one of the things that I would say is, you know, what Mariana was talking about in terms of, you know, thinking about the future, there's a lot that we're responsible for. So there is the funder relationship that is one side of the coin. And the other side of the coin is that you're responsible for so many people. Like I am responsible for 30,000 kids eating every single day, for, you know, close to 150 staff members having their salaries and things like that. And I think especially having relationships with funders, that what I've found helpful, that our most, you know, our closest funders are the ones that understand that this is a long game, you know, that are in it with us, that this is a long game and we're going to be in this for a while. and we're trying and believe in, I think what DRK thesis is they believe in the mission, they believe in what we're doing, and they say, okay, we're going to put money into this, and we're going to see if it works, and we're going to see if this thing works, and we're going to try different things with you, because we believe, for example, in our case, that kids should be eating in school, when kids should be accessing nutrition. And so we're going to figure out how it should be done, because we believe that you're working every day and night figuring out how it's done. And so I think that, if I was thinking about things that funders knew, I think also, something that I think would be interesting, with organizations like DRK and focusing philanthropy is how can we educate, educate funders to be able to understand the other side, where, metrics may matter in a certain way, communication may matter in a certain way, but is there a needle that can be moved to kind of like, is there a middle ground that we can get to where, local leaders are looking at impact in this way and funders are looking at impact in this way? Is there a middle ground where we say this is what impact means? And I think, for example, COVID-19 is a really good opportunity for us to start thinking like that, because it's an opportunity to say, okay, people should have access to healthcare, people should have access to food, people should have access to education, people should have access to to employment opportunities. Okay, we've started that. That's the first starting point. So how do we define how we're going to get there? Do we believe this organization is working towards that and investing in that? So I think that's what I wish funders knew how hard it is on the other side, try to make everything work and the craziness that comes with it. Yeah.
So
Stephanie, can I just make a couple comments triggered by the really useful and provocative observations that both Wawira and Mariana just made. I think there might be, let's be careful that we don't fall into the notion that things are just binary. They're either one or the other, that they're either all general support or all project funding. And I think project funding has bad connotations to it. And by the way, I agree with many of the bad connotations, because nonprofits get whipsawed. They get a big grant to do something specific. Then what are they supposed to do? They build up the resources to handle that, and then the grant expires, and the donor goes off to some other project. There's all kinds of pernicious consequences from that. But I think there's sort of a continuum. Just as an example, we fund priority initiatives or programs of our partners, but we've had the same partners in most cases for 10 years. So they know that we're there, and we're engaged in continuous conversation with them about what they're working on, what their challenges are, what their aspirations are, what they think has reached the point where they can double down and invest in greater scale, where they want to experiment in something. And so when we're talking to them about like what would be most useful for us to fund in the next year or over the next 3 years, it's really in the context of what their own institutional aspirations, goals, and experience are. And they know that as long as they continue to meet kind of our basic criteria, that we're highly likely to be supporting them for the indefinite future. So I think that, to me, that feels different from what I would call transactional grants, where there's a one-time swoop down. Sometimes it's very helpful, but where it's not part of it's not possible for the nonprofit to plan and to build year over year because of uncertainty about funding. So that's kind of one thing that I think there's sort of hybrids here. And then the other thing I'll just say is the application process. This is one area where I think we in DRK are pretty different. We not only don't have open applications, we don't have any application process. If you think about our model, we are proactive in approaching a nonprofit at the point where we can answer the question, why are we talking to that nonprofit? Why are we interested in this sector? What are the tactics that we think are going to be most effective? Gee, here's a nonprofit that, based on looking over the fence, appears to be engaged in not only addressing that issue, but employing tactics which we've come to conclude are among the most promising. And now we want to talk about whether we accurately understand that organization and what it's doing, so that we can decide whether there's a good match between us and them. And then we don't have any application process. We have no forms for anything. So what we try to do is we want to understand where the organization already is. We don't want the nonprofit to spend its time trying to read our minds and package what they're doing in some way that they think will be attractive to us. That's an exercise in fiction writing too often. What we want to know is, what are they already doing, and how can we most efficiently gain an insight into what they're doing and how well they're doing it with the minimum intrusion and the minimum of special work on their part. So, for example, does the nonprofit, if it has an independent board, is there some type of a flash report that's prepared? Mariana and Wawira, I'm sure that you have a few key metrics that you track, where you have statistics on your desk all the time. I can guess what they would be, but you'd be able to say it. And I suspect that you share those with your board at some interval. Well, we would just like to see, what is it that you keep on your desk, and what do you share with your board? And we learn a lot from that. And we're not asking you to do anything special other than to be comfortable sharing things that we would treat confidential, that you already are producing. So I think this whole notion of project, application, and all of that it's a powerful topic, but I think that it's possible to do a better job of relating to nonprofits by being alert to how you apply those concepts, and not treat it as kind of a cookie cutter where we have an application process, fill out the form, conform to our vocabulary, meet our deadlines, all of that kind of stuff, which is a big burden on small organizations.
I think also, Larry, maybe it speaks to sort of the stage of growth in the difference between where you are investing versus like a DRK or a Siegel. But I think for you're coming in with a theory of change, and you're looking for organizations that fit that theory. DRK is saying, we don't really know what the answer is, so let's let Wawira and Mariana tell us, and we're going to fund that. But they're in a much earlier stage than I think where you're coming in.
Yes, I think that.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, Stephanie, I see some questions regarding business models for nonprofits, and I think this is a super interesting topic. Maybe we can address, and alternative paths of funding for nonprofits. I think that's super important, because obviously there's a range. I try to think of it that way. I think there's some nonprofits that address issues that really governments should be covering, and it's going to be hard to try and find a business model out of that. I don't know, Wawira, maybe your work is more in that category. It's something that it should be happening. And it's trying to cover for a failure of the government, in many ways. There's other nonprofits in the spectrum where we are, for example, we're in the skilling space, so we are preparing talent, specifically women from underserved backgrounds, to join the growing tech sector with high-paying jobs. And I do feel a huge responsibility to find a path towards financial sustainability, because I do think that we are creating real market value, So in my mind, we do have our own earned revenue, and a huge priority for my organization is to grow that earned revenue. Today we cover around 1/3 of our costs from our own earned revenue, and our goal is, in 3 years' time, be at 50%. And I think if we achieve that, then that's a huge win, because I know that 50% of what I do will be covered by our own capacities to make revenue. Now, the other 50%, why it's hard to get the numbers to cover it fully because I have an accessible I have an accessible model to reach women from underserved backgrounds, right? They don't pay up front, they only pay a subsidized amount, only if they get a job. It's super flexible. So that means that it's harder to make the whole thing profitable. But our North Star is, okay, 50% will cover, and that other 50%, how do we diversify? And it's also our responsibility as leaders of our organizations to build a diverse base of funders that can ensure that overall sustainability for organizations. So we think, okay, today, for example, that base in our case is not as diverse. It's very focused on corporate foundations. So we're thinking, okay, could we set up an endowment, for example? No? Could we set up a base of individual contributors so that we can ensure and have that peace of mind that this organization and its impact can be here for the long run through that approach in diversity of our sources of income and not over-reliant in a single funder or in a single type of funder as well.
Yeah, really good point, Mariana. That's a really good point. So I'm going to throw out there a couple, I'm going to come back to a couple questions I saw around small foundations and how they find new local leadership that's not coming from sort of the ones everybody already knows. But first, I just want to make a couple points about practices that I love, that I've seen other foundations use, that I think are very respectful of the time that it takes for organizations to go through a diligence process with a foundation. I have seen foundations pay for site visits. So they're coming, they know they're taking a lot of time from the organization, and they'll leave a gift in its wake. I've seen organizations, several of them, Siegel being one, having, in addition to their core grant, a pool of money that's available for ongoing education for the staff, or for rest and recovery for frontline workers, or any number of capacity building consultants and so forth that are helpful to an organization that are not part of the regular grant. So I think there's a lot of creative ways that people are being thoughtful about what it's like to be on the other side of the equation when you're going through a diligence process. There was a couple questions that came out around, like, if we're small grant-making organizations, how do we find these really good organizations? Is it better to be putting into a fund, or how do we identify them? And for sure, I mean, Larry, Focusing Philanthropy, and DRK are two examples of where investors are believing in the work that that our funding organizations are doing, and rather than trying to find good organizations to support themselves, are doing at least some piece of their philanthropy through a grant to this intermediary work. But I'm curious, from Wawira and Mariana, who know a lot of other organizations on the ground, what would you say to people who are looking to find good leadership and might not have people who are in country to find them?
So I think I would start with, I think someone mentioned the Miller Center, which is an accelerator that I went through. I know that they take on very early stage organizations, and if someone wanted to, for example, fund organizations, their kind of pool is very early. So that's the accelerator that I mentioned. That's how we met DRK, that I was part of. So I always recommend. So, for example, a lot of local leaders will come to me and say, what is the right funder? Can you introduce me to someone? And what I do is look at the kind of work that they do, obviously, and whether the specific funders would be interested. And I always recommend, if they're early, the Miller Center, because what I think that the Miller Center does, which was really helpful, as I said, is language, like teaches you the space and teaches you this is, for example, big bang philanthropies. These are the different types of organizations that give funding to organizations like yours. This is how you can position yourself, how you can communicate to them, how you can reach them, and things like that. So I would, I think that if someone is looking to fund the Miller Center pipeline, for me was something that was very early, for me was something useful and where I gained a lot of skills to be able to communicate with funders. Yeah.
Yeah, I would just complement going. I mean, if I were a funder and I was interested in getting to know, more entrepreneurs in a particular country or region, I would go to the local, there's a social entrepreneurship accelerator or organization in every market. There's always one or more than one that's there to promote the social entrepreneurship ecosystem. And I think that's a great starting point, because it's going to be very hard to go to each or to randomly pick without context, no? So these hubs usually know who are the players, who have the most potential to grow, who is ready for this type of investment. Like I think about one here in Peru that I'm part of, and it's usually the best channel to get a better sense, and then probably start getting connected with individual entrepreneurs that fit more or less the criteria that the funder is looking for. But I see a lot of potential there, even in knowledge transfer from funders in the US to funders in my case, I talk about Latin America, my region, but in LATAM, there's such a huge learning opportunity for funders here to learn from the fundraising scene in the US. That's a much more professional one, and it's years beyond than are seen here. So I think there's huge opportunities in that bilateral collaboration with social entrepreneurship hubs in the region.
I think also there's sort of a collection of organizations and individuals in the United States who do this exploration, or searching out really interesting and exciting, high promise nonprofits and leaders. And if people kind of become aware of who those folks are and kind of triangulate, it's a way to leverage the work of others. I wouldn't rely on any one, but for example, we are definitely interested in what the Arcade portfolio looks like. We look at what Elma Philanthropy's portfolio looks like. We look at what the Skoll Foundation does. We look to see which organizations Nicholas Kristof writes about in his New York Times columns. So, and we look to see who's led by an Ashoka Fellow, who's led by an Echoing Green Fellow. There's, those would be prime examples, I would think. And then I'm sure there's others I'm not mentioning. And if you look across their portfolios and you're kind of systematic, you say, well, I'm interested in this geography or this area of human need or whatever it is, and you see who's appearing on those portfolios. It isn't just positive, but it is reflective of at least some thoughtful and systematic screening process that people can leverage as a way to at least focus. Otherwise, it's like trying to boil the ocean. There's just way too many things to think about, and you need some way to concentrate, or else it's paralyzing. So we certainly look to all of those organizations and others to kind of inform our thinking as we're trying to focus on an area.
Really
small foundation could do that.
Yeah, point really well taken, Larry. And as somebody, as Lisa commented, another place to look along the lines you're saying is just local community foundations in country that can have also a lens on a different group of people. I think another, another practice that we as a community can do for organizations like Food for Education and Laboratoria is to make introductions. And I think that's a very powerful funder tool that gets underutilized, that can be really useful to them. And Mariana or Wawira, maybe you have something to add to that thought.
Yeah, so I think, to Larry's point, the previous point, before I add about the introductions, I think that, kind of something that I've seen in terms of, and I think someone asked that question around, nonprofit stars. So when you're reading off the same kind of list and everyone is funding the same kind of people, I mean, sometimes Food for Education is in a lot of, for example, big bank philanthropy funders and things like that. But I think to your point, Stephanie, there is need to go into local networks as well, because sometimes there's a bias of, you're funding the same type of nonprofits across all the funders and other nonprofits that are coming in. And that bias most of the times is those people who came in speak a certain way, they inspire confidence in this certain way, and therefore everyone trusts them. But there are also local entrepreneurs who could receive this funding but are not in that network. They're not starting off, for example, in this type of bigger organizations, and therefore are not able to get the funding and are not able to be on this list, right? In terms of introductions, something that DRK really does well actually is introductions. I find that, on average, a lot of our funders have been introduced, through the DRK network actually. So I think that funder introductions are really, really important, and also DRK advocates on behalf. So by the time they're doing an introduction, for example, Emily on the team, they will have had a couple of conversations about you to the funder. So by the time you're meeting with the funder already has, a lot of information. And, for example, DRK talking about you to a funder is very, very important, because it sort of solidifies your case before you even get into the room. So I think that's something that really helps, where DRK specifically will have calls before and introduce you before you get into the room. Yeah.
That you all have made you've really helped highlight, I think, what our goal was today, which was to really show that there's different lenses on the work. And I'll tell you that the key takeaway that I've had from our conversation today is my role as a funder as both a learner and an educator. And that I understand how much I have to learn and how much I don't know about what's happening in a lot of different settings on the ground. And it is on me to go really listen carefully and be open to learning and hearing about different things in different language than I may have been trained in myself, and to be an open learner in that way. And also, the other thing I've taken away from this conversation is my opportunity to be an educator with other funders, that we bring a lot of people into all the people who are part of this symposium are already thinking deeply every day about philanthropy, but there's a lot of other people out there who have finding the balance between making it easy for them to apply their resources while also educating them about the reality of what makes for real change. I think is an opportunity that I'm taking away from this conversation, is my role as an educator as well as a learner. Larry and Mariana and Wawira, I want to thank you for the time you spent today, but also for the incredible intention and hard work that you put into executing on your strategies. And I've learned a lot from talking with all of you. Thank you for everybody who's been listening in, for all the great questions. Look forward to having opportunities to connect with any of you individually who have more of a conversation to have with any of us. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for the event, and to all our funders who continue supporting our work and make it possible.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.